good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Cray, and I'm a professor at the Haas School of Business, and I'm delighted to have this next hour with you to build on this wonderful theme of bringing your best self to work. I have a tough act to follow, obviously, with that keynote, but I do think it actually builds really nicely on at least the tail end of what I heard, because what I'm going to talk to you about is more stuff that's going on here at Berkeley and at other college campuses around the country, studying the psychology, what's called the new psychology of success. So this is going to be more of a research-based talk, but one that I hope you will find to be very practical as well, because this research sort of started in the laboratory many years ago, probably 25 years ago. Carol Dweck, who is a researcher who's now down at Stanford, is a developmental psychologist, and she started studying how beliefs of young children about intelligence impact their success in school. And in the 25 years since she first started doing this research, a number of people, myself included, have built on it in such a way that we're now studying what she calls mindsets within organizations, top companies around the globe, Fortune 500 companies, et cetera, looking at mindsets and how they affect our graduate students here on Berkeley's campus, for example. And I can tell you in a nutshell that mindsets are incredibly powerful. And so what I hope to do today is to convince you of that, to really raise your awareness about mindsets and how they creep into our thinking, and that there are certain mindsets that are going to facilitate our success, and certain mindsets that we may find at times are holding us back. And so when we learn the language of mindsets and we become more aware of how mindsets operate within ourselves, then we become empowered to change our mindset in a more productive direction. I also we find studying teams within organizations that individual team members, their mindsets, can permeate and influence the entire culture of a team, and they can also accrue up to the level of an entire organization. We're studying with Carol Dweck and Jenny Chapman, who's also a professor at Haas. We're studying mindsets and how they actually lead to and embody organizational cultures of an entire organization. So I'm hoping that you will find this interesting. Raise your hand if by chance you've read Carol Dweck's book on the new psychology of success. Okay, so we've got some converts, obviously, in the audience. You're here. You know this is important. But the rest of you, I will assume that this is relatively new information. And I want to invite you at any point, if you have questions, just raise your hand. And we've got a couple of monitors around the room who will come and give you a microphone. So this presentation is being videotaped, and so they want to make sure that the questions can be heard. But by all means, feel free to jump in at any point. Okay, so this presentation, again, is unlocking the power of growth mindsets. What are growth mindsets? Well, so let me ask you the following. Do you think, are good leaders born that way? Raise your hand if you say yes affirmatively. Nobody. All right, raise your hand if you say no, good leaders are not born that way. Absolutely not. And raise your hand if you're sort of somewhere in the middle. Okay. How about this one? People have a certain amount of talent, and there is not much that can be done to really change that. Absolutely yes. Absolutely no. And somewhere in the middle. Okay. Do a couple more. Everyone, no matter who they are, can significantly change how they handle conflict with others. Absolutely yes. Absolutely not. And somewhere in the middle. Okay. Motivation and dedication often trump natural talent in producing top business results or academic results, whatever you think. How many of you are going to put your money on motivation and dedication? How many are going to put your money on natural talent? And how many of you are going to hedge your bet? And then people can do things differently, but the important part of who they are, their personality, their essence, can't really be changed. How many of you say, yeah, you kind of have a core personality that you're born with, and anybody who's a parent who has multiple children will tell you that they were born different coming out of the womb, right? They are just different, okay? How many of you would say anybody can change anything about themselves if they set their minds to it? And finally, somewhere in the middle. Okay, so you can see that in this room there is a wide variety of beliefs that we hold about a number of different domains. We can talk about mindsets as they relate to intelligence. We can talk about mindsets as they relate to talent. You can think about talent as, let's say athletic ability, athletic talent, musical talent, right? There are all sorts of different domains in which we may hold beliefs about how fixed a certain amount of talent is in a person versus how malleable it is, right? And this is really what the essence of the mindset is about. Mindsets speak to whether we believe a given attribute, a characteristic of ourselves or of other people can change. And fundamentally, mindsets are subjective, okay? So we could, debate all day here the difference between nature and nurture and what roles they play in our lives, right? We can all probably appreciate certain gifts that we were born with or that things that come easily to us and things that we have to work at really hard, right? But mindsets are not about, well, I'm going to measure, sort of your IQ, and that's sort of what it is. What may be objectively true on a piece of paper, how you score on a standardized exam. What mindsets are really about and where they derive their power is in their subjectivity, right? It doesn't matter what's actually true. What we believe is what influences how we do, okay? So I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit further. So in terms of thinking and defining mindsets, how we can think about them is that we all have, a lot of variability within ourselves in terms of our personalities, in terms of our temperaments. Were you born sunny side up or, a little grouchy? What sort of habits and preferences, et cetera, right? We're all different, right? And how we are today is probably not identical to how we were a decade ago, right? So we all change. But there are certain ways in which we may believe that certain things are fixed and other attributes are malleable, right? So you can think about something that maybe many people find challenging, like math performance, right? So to what extent do you just have a fixed amount of talent when it comes to doing math versus with enough hard work and effort, do you feel confident that you could improve your math ability? And that really, those two, sort of extremes embody what we call a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And again, in reality, as you saw, most of you were somewhere in the middle for most of those questions I asked you. And my point here is not to, sort of diagnose what your mindset is. It's more just sort of an educational tool to see sort of where do you fall along these different, sort of beliefs. And mindsets are really important because, again, they influence whether we think attributes can be developed or not. And why does that matter? Well, let's take math ability. Let's say you are, you're being given a math exam, and this is a pretty elementary math exam with problems like, what is 2 plus 3? Most of us can probably answer that question fairly easily without the mindset that we hold about math making a difference, okay? Because it's well within our capacity to do simple arithmetic, unless you're, multitasking or put on the spot, and et cetera, all the ways in which we can get tripped up. But let's say instead of a very simple math problem, you're working on something that's extremely difficult. You find yourself in, a graduate level math class, doing, advanced calculus, okay? Tough problems. Now let's say you believe that you have a certain amount of math ability, and sort of in the back of your mind, you're remembering that you never made it to calculus in high school, and you didn't like math, you didn't like that math teacher, you were really glad when your math requirements in college were complete, etc. You might say, I'm not very good at math. Okay, and if you have a fixed mindset, it's not just I'm not good at math, it's that I'm never going to be good at math. Okay, so here you are faced with this difficult math problem, and you're holding this belief that not only are you not good, but that you can't change this. Well, you encounter a math problem that you don't know if you can solve, right? You've never seen something like this before. You're not sure what the best way is to approach it. You're not even sure if it's solvable. So if in the back of your head you have a voice that's running that says, you're not any good at this, you're never going to get this right, you don't know what you're doing, you're just here making a fool of yourself, what would be a natural response? You've got this really difficult math exam, don't know if you can solve it, you've got this critical voice in your head telling you you're never going to get any better at this. What's a rational response? Give up. Absolutely. Right? So what happens is when you have a fixed mindset, people tend to, they'll try as hard as they can until they encounter a challenge. And at that point, they say, aha, here's the limit. Here's where I can't go any further. The rational thing to do is not waste your time, right? And to disidentify with the domain and avoid doing math at all costs. Now, let's say instead you have a very much of what we call a growth mindset. You can still say, I'm not any good at math, I never liked this in high school, et cetera, all that same, sort of assessment of yourself in terms of how good you are. But on top of that, you say, but I know that even if I fail at this math exam right here, if I stick with it, I still might learn something. Okay, so the difference between the fixed mindset and the growth mindset is that when we have a fixed mindset, we tend to give up more easily, right? And secondly, we tend to go into situations with the goal of trying to prove ourselves as opposed to develop ourselves. And so what happens is that we say, well, I'm going to, go in here and do my best to convince my teacher, convince everybody else in this room that I know what I'm doing, right? So they don't think poorly of me, but I'm really going to avoid challenging myself where I could really look like a fool. Does that make sense? Okay, so mindsets are extremely important for influencing how we lead our lives, right? What sort of challenges we embrace, what we shy away from. And the research very clearly shows that we tend to, fixed mindsets don't serve us. Okay, the more we have a fixed mindset, the more we are creating additional obstacles for ourselves in terms of the theme of the conference, our ability to show up and bring our best selves to work, right? What does it mean to be your best self, right? So we can distinguish between the self I am today, the capacities that I have in front of me already, right, that I can put to work to solve whatever problems I have. But then there's also my ideal self, the self that I'm working towards, right? The self that, is a little bit, smooths out some of those rough edges in terms of how I work with my coworkers, in terms of how I write up my research papers. Whatever it is that your job entails, I'm sure there are things about it that you feel quite proud of and capable of, and then things that you would like to further develop. And when we go show up at work with a growth mindset, we are better positioned to address those challenges, okay? So the fixed mindset, again, is just this belief that whatever ability you're talking about is rigid. It's like you were born with it. There may be a part of your brain that is dedicated to this ability, and your brain, you kind of have a conceptualization of your brain as being very rigid. And so it tends to correspond with beliefs like people either have it or they don't, right? That's a fixed mindset. And as I stated, the fixed mindset tends to lead people to adopt goals of performing, of proving themselves. And the downside to, so again, if you're working on something quite simple, like I'm going to prove to you that I can do basic arithmetic, boom, I can do that probably pretty easily. I can convince you that I can add simple math. But what happens is that as those math problems get more and more difficult, right, then that voice in the back of my head starts saying, okay, Laura, you're up against your limit. You better cut your losses now rather than expose yourself as a fool. Okay? So, and what we also find is that it's not just giving up more easily, it's that when you have a fixed mindset, you tend to resort to some less than, sort of admirable tricks and tactics to try and prove to others that you have what it takes. So we find that fixed mindsets, people are relatively vulnerable to ethical lapses, so cheating, not reporting, sort of their real performance, all of those sorts of things. We find that within organizations, when people perceive their manager as having a fixed mindset, they're more likely to say things like, yeah, my manager takes my ideas and, takes credit for them. Right? Because really what's going on in the mind of that manager, assuming that his or her employees are accurately reporting what they see, is that that manager is trying to prove themselves, right? And as we move up in sort of organizational ranks, as we become leaders, as other people look to us as managers and in charge, when we have a fixed mindset about leadership, this can have extremely detrimental consequences because it reduces our openness to feedback from others. It reduces our capacity to collaborate with others because we go into situations trying to prove how smart we are, right? Rather than to learn from others. And we find that when people have fixed mindsets, they tend, because again, everything is sort of about the ego, they tend to be more sort of keeping score in terms of, oh, that one time when you spoke up and you contradicted me in that meeting and embarrassed me, I'm not going to forget it, and you better look out. Okay, so fixed mindsets carry a lot of risks, shall we say. As you continue to challenge yourself and move into domains and work on tasks that you've never done before, that you're not sure how to resolve, then the fixed mindset becomes a greater and greater impediment. So let's contrast that with the growth mindset. So this is the belief that abilities are relatively flexible, right? We can, we can develop, we can grow, we can change. People can learn. And again, growth mindsets, instead of saying, I'm just going to go in here and prove how smart I am, growth mindsets tend to enable people to show up with more humility, right, with more vulnerability. So that ends up being perceived as more authentic, right? And so you may say, yeah, but I mean, people want leaders who are in charge and who have the answers, right? And so you're giving up your power when you go in and admit you don't know how to do something, right? And so really what you have to remember, though, is that when we go in with a sense of openness to feedback and sort of let's figure this out together, more collaborative attitude, chances are you are going to engage your team more. You are going to generate a more diverse set of options for how to solve whatever problem you have in front of you because you're inviting input and feedback and sort of back and forth, problem solving in the environment around you. And that's going to lift you all up, right, so that everybody does better and you can count on, sort of the credit being collectively distributed. Right? So when we find that when people work for others who embody the growth mindset, it generates higher commitment, right? Greater satisfaction, right? And a greater sense of purpose and meaning in the work that you're doing. Right? So everything that we can do to embody the growth mindset is likely to move us in the direction of success. Right? So that's sort of the big overview. And again, mindsets operate at multiple levels. We can, lots of research that's been done just on mindsets at the level of the individual, right? So as I started talking about Carol Dweck and her early research, she was asking, children as young as kindergarten, right? Can you tell me what intelligence is? they don't have quite the language to elaborate, a detailed theory perhaps, but she would show them a picture of a muscle. And she'd contrast that with a picture of, a piece of plaster. She'd say, which one is intelligence more like? This muscle that you can develop by working out? Or is it more like this piece of plaster that's fixed and you only have so much of it? And she found that at a very young age, there is diversity in terms of how children conceptualized intelligence. Where did their beliefs come from? Well, she sort of traced it back in part to, most of the time, the technical language for mindsets is implicit theory. And implicit means, it operates below the level of conscious awareness. We might not even know that we have a particular mindset unless we stop and think about it, right? And so most parents are not saying to their children, intelligence is like a muscle or intelligence is like plaster, but somehow or other, the children are getting the message. So where's the message coming from? What she finds is that it's in part how the children are praised, right? When they're praised for great job, you got the A or the check plus or whatever it is, versus great job, I know how hard you worked on that, it sends a different signal. It sends a different message. And the more we pay attention to and reward effort and development, then, look how far you've come, right? The more we send a message that the given attribute is something that people can develop, okay? And so I'm going to show you how this sort of trickles up in terms of changing how teams interact with each other in work contexts, and also touch on some of the implications for organizations. And then really hope to end with some tips on how we can move ourselves and others in the direction of growth. Okay, so you can think, you probably can't read all of this right here, but it kind of just shows you how these mindsets are sort of, have a top-down effect on how people perceive the world. You can think of it as like a lens, a set of glasses that you're wearing. It influences how you experience the workplace. It influences how you interact with others, what you share with others in terms of your, sort of vulnerabilities, struggles, challenges, etc. And what we perceive as our main obstacles to success, how we define what effort is, how we respond to criticism, and how we evaluate the success of others. So let me elaborate on some of that. So what is success, right? So what does success look like to you? Is it, I got through another academic year and, got through, whatever the challenge is and I'm still standing, right? They haven't, I haven't been exposed for the imposter that I am, right? Whatever, that sort of, is that how you define success? Or is it about, what did I learn? How am I different today than I was a year ago, right? What new sort of challenges have I overcome, and how is that positioning me to move in the direction of my ideal self? Right, my most fulfilled self, my most, sort of the self that is contributing at the highest possible level to this campus, to the community, and to broader society. And so when you ask people with a fixed mindset, what is talent, or what is success, they tend to they use the language more of talent. It's also, we see it, I'm going to show you some actual mission statements from organizations that kind of reveal more of a fixed mindset. And this is where we can think of it as the tyranny of excellence. Okay, so when excellence is great, except that how do you get there? Right? And when you have an organization that's all, we value excellence, we hire top talent, right? You can see it's sort of implying that, it's just sort of people come down from, heaven and they just have everything that's required to do the job, and that there's very little effort required in it. So in her book, she talks a lot about Enron. Remember the smartest guys in the room? that was a very fixed mindset organization, right? And when they were, when the market was going well and, early on in their existence, everything was fine, right? They'd hire the best and the brightest. That's what let's get all the, Ivy Leaguers and et cetera, and the rest will take care of itself. But, sort of in hindsight, you can see the culture was one where people, sort of like to wing it, right? They didn't really want to put in the hard work, because if they had to put in the hard work, that meant that they weren't that smart, if that makes sense, right? So even over at Haas, I've done some work looking at mindsets about negotiating ability. I teach negotiations, and I always give my students a quiz on the first day of class that measures their mindset with questions like, to what degree are good negotiators born that way, versus is it a skill you can develop? Now keep in mind, these are graduate students at this top university who are paying good money and have other, their opportunity costs to them taking my class, because they're sitting in my class as opposed to another class. So presumably they believe there's something they can learn from being there, right? It's an elective class. But even within that, sort of pool of people who've self-selected into the class, there's variability in terms of how much they think negotiating ability is something you can develop versus it's something you're born with. And what I showed in a paper when I first started studying this is that how my students responded to that little survey on the first day of class. So when I first measured it, I gave them the survey, talked a little bit about mindsets, tried to make the case that it was applicable to negotiations, but I didn't know for sure because I didn't have any data. But over time, what I found after the class ended and after I turned in grades, I went back and scored their mindsets and found that how students responded on that first day of class to that survey predicted their grade 15 weeks later. Okay? And I could go into each of the weekly role play negotiations that they did and look at how well did they do. Were they, claiming more of the value? Were they coming up with creative solutions? Whatever the, sort of lesson was for each of the simulations that they do in class, I could track their performance. And what we found is that across the board, people who had the growth mindset were doing better. And why? Why were they doing better? Well, at certain points, we would ask them, we'd give them their materials to prepare for the negotiations outside of class, and they come into class and they do these role plays that get increasingly complex throughout the semester. And so we just asked them in a little online survey, how many minutes did you spend preparing outside of class? And what we found is that the fixed mindset students were winging it. Right? They didn't think that they should have to work for it, because that would imply that they weren't very good at it. Right? So if you conceptualize something as you either have it or you don't, then there really isn't a whole lot of role for effort in there. So again, what is failure? Learning from your mistakes versus covering up your mistakes. Right? Again, if you believe that you either have it or you don't, there's not a whole lot of to be gained by admitting errors. But if you think that, hey, everybody, has to confront these challenges and nobody was born knowing how to negotiate, right? Or, maybe some people have more experience than others, but anybody can become better at this than what they're more likely to do. They're the students who are more likely to show up in my office hours and say, I'm trying to understand why I'm getting this feedback from my peers when I do these negotiations. Or I don't understand how, why we left so much money on the table in this role play. And they really want to get to the bottom of it. It's a deeper level of information processing and analysis that we're seeing. And, is effort good or bad? Do you prepare? Do you wing it? Do you work to overcome obstacles? Or do you give up? And in another study, we know what their mindsets are, and we give them the opportunity to select what kind of task they're going to work on. We say you can either do negotiation task A. This is really simple. You probably won't learn anything, but it's just an opportunity to negotiate. versus negotiation task B, this is really challenging, you might fail, but you'll still learn something. Which one do you want to do? Not surprisingly, the growth mindset students are more willing to take that risk with the more challenging task. And so growth mindsets improve performance along a number of performance metrics, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about collaboration in the context of a real-world example in a moment. As I said, they're more analytical, more likely to, when you have a growth mindset, more likely to, sort of think in terms of cause and effect, right? So if I would have asked more questions in that negotiation, I would have gotten more information to understand what really mattered to the other side. And so when you do that, when you kind of put A and B together and you connect the dots, right, then you're learning, right? You're learning what causes what, and you're also sort of providing more of a roadmap to yourself for how you're going to approach it the next time. Whereas when you have a fixed mindset, that analysis tends to look a little bit more like, well, she was really stubborn. That's why we didn't do well, right? It's more shifting the blame, not really, sort of looking within, because it's more defensive. What we're also finding, some ongoing research now, is that, people can see your mindset. Okay, you might not know your mindset, but people can see it. And our students who have more of a growth mindset are being rated by their peers, who don't know officially what their mindset is, as better negotiators, as sort of having the skills that they admire more. So it has reputational consequences. Talked about the ethical standards, and some interesting research that's been going on, again, within organizations, looking at the mindsets of managers and what influence does that have on their mentoring of employees, right? Do they give feedback? Do they encourage their team members? And what you find is that, again, just having the belief that people can change and grow motivates people to provide more feedback. Yes, we have a question over here. So the question is whether there are generational differences. Not in a perfectly, sort of quantifiable way. I will say that I've studied mindsets on negotiation with undergraduate students and with graduate students who have about 10 years of work experience. And what we find is that the older students tend to have more of a growth mindset. Now, well, whether, but that's, they're sort of still early on in their careers. So whether, you kind of hit a turning point and you say, I can't change anymore after age whatever, I don't know. I don't think that we have a real answer for that, but yeah. Okay, so mindsets matter, and I want to focus on how they influence how we collaborate with others, right? And essentially, the idea of a growth mindset is that it leads to more effective collaboration because it enables you to signal psychological safety to those around you. So what is psychological safety? It's that feeling in the room when you know it's safe to speak up, when you know it's safe to disagree, when you know it's safe to, propose an alternative, right? It's something that people invite, whether it be through eye contact, whether it be through body language, whether it be through direct questioning. Is there anybody who, wants to take a different, stance here, or has, who is on the fence and, is skeptical of what I'm saying here? Sort of taking those steps to invite feedback and input and debate, that signals psychological safety. And that's what we need. So when we talk about diversity, right, aside from it being, sort of a social justice issue, diversity, we want diversity because it leads to better decision making, better problem solving, right? The idea being that when we come at this problem from a variety of different perspectives, then we will generate higher quality solutions, right? But we're not going to do that if we, if I'm the only person who gets to talk, right? Because I'm a leader with a fixed mindset, and I want to prove to you, how that, all that schooling and all this hard work that I've done, look at me, right? But that's a fixed mindset, right? And so when psychological safety is absent, right, we know it, right? We know when it is unsafe to speak up. And we find that there's a strong tendency in teams. So if you have a group of 5 people coming together at a meeting, we find that 2 people tend to do about 2/3 of the speaking, right? And when we add a 6th person, then 2 people are still doing over 50% of the speaking. We add a 7th person, now 3 people are doing 70% of the speaking. And this counteracts the value of diversity. Right? And this idea of collective intelligence is, can we harness our own experiences, our own preferences, our own values, our own, sort of knowledge, and bring it together to create something larger than, our individual parts. And that happens through, so there's a piece that was just published a couple years ago in Science on collective intelligence and looking at, are there various properties of teams? If I were to randomly assign you to be on a team and give you, a bunch of different problem-solving tasks. You're going to do an analytical problem-solving task. You're going to do a moral problem-solving task. You're going to do a negotiation. I'm going to give you a whole battery of tests and see how you and your team do together. Well, what these researchers found is that, on the one hand, you might say, well, let's just get the smartest people on the team, right? And the rest will take care of itself. So I'm going to measure everybody's IQ, or I want you to submit your SAT scores, or whatever it is, how we're going to measure this. That's one way of doing it. Does that tend to lead to higher performance? No. Instead, what leads to higher performance is a sort of a social dynamic. The best predictor of how your team is going to do, without me knowing anything else about you, is if I just put a little recording device on the table when you're working on these tasks, and all it's going to do is track how many minutes does each person get to speak. And the more equality of participation there is, the greater the collective intelligence. Okay? And this particular study, the only, sort of demographic variable that they tracked that would correspond with more diversity is just the gender ratio on the team. And what they tended to find that adding more women to the team led to more equality of participation. Right now, we don't know if that's a property of gender or a property of diversity, okay? But that's what they found, okay? So what that means is even when you're in charge, right, if you're bringing a team together to make a decision, to solve a problem, to come up with a strategy, whatever it is, you want to be mindful of, allowing the collective intelligence to take root. And that happens through psychological safety. And so I want to distinguish between 2 different kinds of teams, right? We can say our team is coming together to execute something that we already know how to do, that's this is something that is well understood, and we're just trying to maximize efficiency here, right? That's where what you need to do is make sure everybody knows what the task is, what's the order in which we do the task, and who's in charge of what, right? So a classic execution task would be building a new car on an assembly line, right? We know there's a certain order in which things need to take place, and everybody needs to know exactly what they're responsible for. And if we do that well, we will have some nice cars to sell. Now contrast that with learning teams. If the reason you're coming together is not to execute because you don't know, you've never done this before, but you're in a dynamic and uncertain and changing work environment, and you're being confronted with a problem that you haven't necessarily faced before, then you're a learning team. And the number one most important thing that you can do to maximize your odds of success is to create psychological safety. And we can't fake it, right? In the sense of if you go into situations, you're in charge and you have a fixed mindset, even if you know this is true on a conceptual level, chances are you're going to run into some challenges because it feels too vulnerable, right, to open up the floor. Okay. So let me give you an example of this. This is a study that was done out of Harvard with a number of different hospitals in the greater metropolitan Boston area. They were all rolling out a new procedure for cardiac surgery. And this procedure is minimally invasive and something that nobody had done before. And it was being rolled out at the same time across all of these different hospitals. And you can see the team itself was comprised of, a number of people with different roles, okay? The surgeon, the surgeon's assistant, a scrub nurse, an anesthesiologist, and a perfusionist, okay? And so what the researchers are looking at is what contributes to success, right? And the success, as they're defining it, is how much time is the patient spending on the operating table? Now you may say, well, hold on a second here. I would like them to take their time with me. If I were the patient, I don't want them rushing through, right? If it's going to come at a cost to my health. They made sure that that wasn't the case, and they controlled for the health outcomes of the patient statistically. So that's not what they're looking at. They're looking at, this is a, there's more risk to the patient the longer they're on the operating table, and it's more costly to the hospital. So we want to learn how to do this procedure as efficiently as possible without sacrificing health. And it's going to take us a while the first time we do it, but we want to improve our numbers over time. We want to get more efficient. So that's what they're tracking. And they looked at, again, a number of different teams, but I'm just going to focus on two extremes here. But the overall pattern holds, and in a nutshell, the more the team has a growth mindset, the better they do. But let me show you sort of how that dynamic unfolds. So here we have two teams, a fixed mindset team. So this was actually a very experienced surgeon at a very prestigious research hospital. But this surgeon, they interviewed the surgeons, they interviewed members of the team to sort of see, they observed them on the operating table, et cetera. And what they found is that the leader tended to see himself in this case as being quite separate from his team. When asked, well, how did you decide who was going to be on your team? He said, whoever was scheduled to work that day. When they asked him about, sort of, how challenging is this new procedure, he tended to discount it and say, it's more like a plug-in procedure. I have a lot of experience. This is just a minor, sort of modification. He conceptualized it as being, sort of not super challenging. Contrast that with the growth mindset team. Here we actually had a surgeon who was relatively inexperienced, who was younger, who was at a more modest regional hospital. But when he asked about his team, he saw himself as being an integral part of it. He was involved from step one in getting the right people on the team, people who he thought had, sort of were excited about this challenge, not only had the technical skills, but also the communication skills, the social intelligence, right, the ability to work well with others. And he kept that team intact. He said, if we're going to reap the benefits of working together and capitalizing on our learnings, we need to do this together a number of times. So it's like a fundamentally different approach that they naturally adopted. And when asked about the task itself, he conceptualized it as a team innovation project. Okay, so really had a different ring to it. And let's take a look at the data. So this is how many minutes or how many hours was the patient on the operating table is the y-axis, and the x-axis is how many different times had they done the procedure. So what you can see is that right out of the starting gate, the mindset didn't make a huge difference. Everybody's figuring this out for the very first time. But the growth mindset, even after just 5 procedures, that growth mindset team, that patient was on the operating table 1 hour fewer, 1 less hour than with the fixed mindset team. And that advantage continued to grow and was maintained after 20 different procedures. Okay, so, and these are just 2 examples. The overall trend was that the more the surgeon went into this task with a growth mindset, the more team members experience psychological safety, that enabled them to offer suggestions and ideas about how they could improve, that the surgeon heard, listened to, responded to, and they could adjust their procedures. Yes, over here. Right, so yes, growth mindset surgeons, right, the growth mindset surgeon here is interested in being involved in getting the right people on the team. I'm not sure that he had the language of mindset, but I think intuitively he was probably looking for people who had similar attributes, right? And so, whereas the fixed mindset surgeon is more disengaged from the process. Right, so yeah, to the degree that you have the ability to select for growth mindsets, and you have a growth mindset, then you're gonna hit the ground running, right? And it doesn't mean you're not gonna encounter challenges, it just means that you're going to more quickly and perhaps more easily create a dynamic with those around you that, you know, is prepared to confront those challenges. And so the fixed mindset surgeon made comments like, you know, it's not a matter of training myself, it's a matter of training my team, right? Like, I'm all-knowing, I'm all-powerful, and he also said, once I get the team set up, I never look up, right? It's they who have to make sure that everything is flowing, right? So very hierarchical. Right? Versus the growth mindset, the ability of the surgeon to allow himself to become a partner, not a dictator, is critical. Growth mindset surgeon, you really do have to change what you're doing based on a suggestion from someone else on the team. Right? So, you know, just how they speak, how they interact with others embodies this fixed versus growth mindset. And maybe, just maybe, I don't know all the details of this situation, but maybe a fixed mindset was at play here. So Johns Hopkins hospital nurses didn't speak up when doctors skipped sterilization checklist items. We got lots of examples of planes crashing as well. I didn't want to go there today, but you know, where the cockpit crew didn't speak up when the captain, you know, such and such, right? So when we're too hierarchical, when we're too deferential, more often than not, that's because we do not experience psychological safety, which means somewhere in the back of our minds, we do a cost-benefit analysis and we say, the costs of me speaking up and, you know, offending or, you know, sort of incurring the wrath, whatever it is, are too great, it's not worth it. Right? And it's not just, you know, obviously if you think that somebody's life is in danger, if you truly believe that, then you're going to speak up. But you have to remember, we're all operating in an environment of uncertainty, right? We don't know if we're, you know, over dramatizing things, if we're overreacting, etc. So we doubt ourselves as well when we're in an environment where psychological safety is absent. Right? So people feel ready and able to speak up when a clear rationale exists in their mind for why their input is needed. And it's extremely helpful if a leader asks for input in a clear and genuine manner, right? And so that's where, you know, sort of having the growth mindset, just, it becomes a more, you know, sort of habitual thing that we do. And remember that if you're seeking input from others, if you're trying to create a collaborative environment around you, that, you know, just think of people as doing this sort of implicit cost-benefit analysis. And the balance of consequences has to be positive, where they believe that their speaking up is likely to be interpreted as an opportunity for learning as opposed to a sign of disrespect. And if you're holding the fixed mindset, that's going to be harder for you to get there. So how do we develop the growth mindset? One, learn to hear the fixed mindset voice in our heads, right? That is that critical voice that tells us we don't have what it takes, right? And we're never going to get there, right? And the wounds that we carry with us from times in which we haven't done well on something and, you know, that teacher who shamed us, right? Or something, those sorts of bad experiences that we carry through into adulthood and that really, kind of shape who we think we are and what we're capable of. So learning to hear that voice, recognizing that you have a choice, that there's a different way of speaking to yourself, and there's a different way of interacting with others that's more open and collaborative and, sort of more likely to generate collective intelligence. Talk back with a growth mindset voice. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. And then take the growth mindset action. So this could be, I'm never going to be good at math, right? I can't believe I've been assigned this task. Here I am on this research team, and we all have different things. I love doing the writing, but now I'm the one who has to learn how to do this new statistical technique that I've never done before. So I'm no good at this, versus saying, okay, well, what would a growth mindset look like? Okay, so I'm still no good at it, but what would a growth mindset look like? Well, I'd probably remind myself that those colleagues of mine who I admire so much and who seem to know how to do this, that there was a time when they didn't, right? That, a way to learn is to, reach out to people, to ask for input, to get feedback, to, trial and error, work on, various problems. It's chip away at the problem, right? It's an incremental approach to, just how do I figure this out? Do I have to go over to the D lab on campus? Do I have to hire a tutor? What is it that I need to do, and get to work on it? So, you don't have the talent becomes, well, if I can't do it now, I will learn with time and effort. If the voice is, here I've gone and exposed my weakness, I remind myself that most successful people had failures along the way, right? And if I'm fortunate enough to have a mentor or a trusted colleague who I can share my, sort of challenges with, hopefully he or she will be willing to share with me stories of how they've grown and changed along the way as well, right? So as faculty on campus here, we all have our, sort of horror stories about that class that, tanked, and, times in which we have not been met with a warm reception in a, in a classroom or speaking environment. And, so how do you learn how to do that better? Right? It's, you take the time, you go and you watch people who are good at it. You get feedback from students. You get coaching, whatever it is that you need to do. Or it's not my fault, to if I don't take responsibility, I can't fix it. And, a fixed mindset, you can also apply to things that you think you're good at, right? I'm naturally gifted at X, right? That's still a fixed mindset. And again, just ask yourself, if you are good at something, are you taking it as far as you can? Or are you kind of hanging out in the comfort zone, right? Where you don't have to be exposed. So how do we foster growth mindsets? Get in the habit of seeking input from others, asking questions, seeking feedback, and inviting debate. Right? And so you can be very deliberate about this in terms of, your monthly lunch that you gather some of your colleagues and, to talk about, sort of your growth mindsets and what you're working on with yourselves. But know that, of course, you have to be prepared to listen, right? And sometimes that means you're going to get critical feedback. Sometimes you're going to have to look at, things that you are not good at, but if you're willing to stare it in the face, right, and actually, kind of, again, break it down into its little small pieces, you can make incremental progress, and you will grow through the awareness, right? Denying our deficiencies is not the answer. Profit from your mistakes by developing a system so that you can track your development over time. So the diary, the journal, the self-reflection, right? That is the key. And so much as we move up in organizations, right, there are fewer, our technical skills become less relevant and our interpersonal skills become more relevant. And our ability to inspire, sort of others, our ability to think strategically, all of those sorts of things we can get better at too through practice. And so whatever, I don't want you to walk away from this talk saying, I'm going to, totally change who I am. Maybe pick one thing that you want to work on. Right? And it can be a technical skill. I'm going to learn that statistical package that I've been putting off. Things are changing so quickly. Or it could be, I'm going to learn to be more patient with my colleagues. Right? And what does that look like? Right? And who around me embodies the patience that I wish I had in myself? Right? And how does that play out? What are the behaviors that align with, that signal patience? Right? It's giving people the time to speak. It's, sort of the nodding, the open body gestures, the things that invite more input from others. And so you have to see around you role models. And also, I want to invite you to be that person who inspires a growth mindset around you through your willingness to be vulnerable and tell your story. Right? Tell the stories about those challenges that you faced early on in your career and how you've grown from them, right? That is, we're all hungry for those messages around us and that encouragement and that hope, right? And oftentimes, if you're not aware of how the mindset influences our capacity to perform, then we might not even be taking the time to look back. Right? So I want to encourage you to be more deliberate about that and have your handwritten little journal that you can go to and jot notes about, hey, I've been wanting to be more patient. I've been wanting to, speak up more in meetings, and, I did it. And this is what I did, and here's how I prepared myself for it. Here's how I might do it differently if I could do it over again. Right? But don't be afraid to pat yourself on the back either. And then get the right people on your teams. So select for growth mindsets, and this means developing a habit of guiding others rather than judging, right? The fixed mindset is, we know also that people who have fixed mindsets tend to buy into stereotypes more than people with growth mindsets, because it's sort of like in the back of your mind as a fixed mindset, you're just trying to categorize people. Good at math, bad at math. And you tend to look at, sort of superficial cues about people, their age, their, race, their gender, their socioeconomic class, and you say, aha, people like that are this way, right? So when you break from the fixed mindset, you tend to see people as more as individuals, as evolving and changing, and you're less, prone to pigeonholing. So get people who have the growth mindset, who are passionate about learning, who are willing to talk about, their challenges and failures, and you want to make sure that you reward the collaboration that you're striving for. So just to end, I'll give you a couple examples of, of organizations that differ in these mindsets. So here's Workplace A, where they're described as, it was a company that prized sheer brain power above all else, where the task of sorting out intellectual stars from the merely super bright was the top priority when making hires and promotions. And it was an environment where one of the most powerful executives was described as being so sure that he was the smartest guy in the room that anyone who disagreed with him was summarily dismissed as just not bright enough to get it. Okay, who wants to work there? Versus in Workplace B, so in public statements, staff proudly described their leaders' growth and learning over 35 years, going from sales rep to the head of the organization. Managers expected their workers to show a passion and love for learning and expanding knowledge. Instead of proving how smart a person or division was, the focus was on making a contribution, investing in the experiences and development of a larger portion of talent, and intense on-the-job learning. How many of you would like to work here? Okay, so this happens to be Enron versus Xerox. Again, we have extracted, some of my colleagues that I'm working with on this organizational culture stuff, extracted actual mission statements from Fortune 500 companies to find clues as to their fixed versus growth mindset. And again, the more the organization it's hyper-focused on talent and excellence and, high-performance enterprise. And everything we do is in pursuit of excellence. Again, excellence is great, but, it's kind of intimidating, right? Versus the growth mindset, we experiment with new ideas. Employees must feel free to make suggestions and complaints. We strive to create a culture supporting ideas and innovation, acknowledging the value of each person's contribution to our company, and facilitating personal and professional development. It's written into their mission statements. And what we did, we asked people, how interested would you be in applying for the job? And tell me, to what extent would you expect that this organization is more collaborative, engages in a lot of unethical behaviors, is innovative, is risk-taking, is trusting, and has employees who are highly committed. An overall pattern is a more positive reaction from the growth mindset than the fixed mindset. So these mindsets are shaping the culture on a number of important organizational dimensions. And again, asking people, we're able to take organizations and categorize them on their mindset based on how employees describe working there. And what we find is that the more the organization has a fixed mindset, the more likely employees are to say things like, there's a lot of cheating and taking shortcuts and cutting corners around here, and people hide information and keep secrets. Versus with the growth mindset, people are more likely to say, my employer genuinely supports risk-taking and will support me even if I fail. And my employer encourages people to be innovative, and when people make mistakes, my employer sees that as value added. So the benefits of growth mindsets are, very numerous, right? Higher satisfaction, trust, ownership over work, higher performance ratings by supervisors. So that means the more employees have growth mindsets, the better they tend to be evaluated. And this more positive organizational culture that translates into collaboration, right? There's a reason why we work in teams as much as we do. The world is highly complex, highly dynamic, highly uncertain, right? We need as much, brain power as we can get, and we get that through working well with each other and maintaining the highest ethical standards, right? That's where we're going to continue on a positive trajectory and not be tripped up by scandal and all sorts of things that you see organizations sort of going down the tubes, right, when these people look the other way with wrongdoing. And finally, more innovative, right? So coming up with new ideas and implementing those ideas in a way that's never been done before, so that we at Berkeley are, sort of the leaders of 21st century academic, sort of higher education institutions. So want to thank you all for listening and for sort of taking these ideas and pondering them. If we have a moment or two, I'm happy to answer any questions. And otherwise, if we're out of time, are we out of time, or have a moment, or are there any questions? Yeah, we have one over here. Maybe we'll take one or two.
Thank you. It's on. Oh, hello. Oh, wow. This is fabulous, and I love the growth mindset. However, I feel like it's a constant challenge to keep it. Mm-hmm. I read somewhere where motivation and this kind of mindset is like a shower. Like no matter how well you do it, you have to do it on a regular basis or it wears off. How do you maintain this? You've given us great suggestions, ideas. I hear it. I agree with it. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. I'm ready to make a difference in my organization. But I know when I get back, there will be a lot of fixed mindsets going around.
Yeah. So
how do you keep that energy?
It's that sadness I felt when I realized for the first time that, if I want to take off those 10 pounds, I can go on a little diet and maybe I'll be successful. But I got to keep it up, right? It's forever. It's not, you don't just do it once and then it's done, right? So yes, it's about constantly, sort of staying on it, working towards growth, right? And so you have to be properly motivated, right? You have to be aware of how powerful mindsets are, And then to your point about, well, not everybody's on the same page with us here, right? Not everybody has a growth mindset, understands the value of growth mindsets. That can be demotivating, right? So, I mean, all I can encourage you to do, again, is to chip away at it by using this language, by, really sharing these ideas, by, sort of, again, developing the language in a way where, you've got that person who's demotivated, who doesn't seem to want to change. Well, you can't, there's only so much you can do, but you could start by talking about your own sort of ways in which you've changed and grown and encourage that person in that way, right? So yeah, it's not a panacea, but it is something that I think opens up a lot of possibilities for people. All right, well, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up, and otherwise enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you so much.